Welcome back to the Political Brief. Today, we're taking a look at a congressional hearing where Senator Josh Hawley goes directly after Army leadership over conditions facing military families at Fort Leonard Wood, and then turns to a very different controversy involving alleged language guidance at an Air Force base in Guam. One part of this hearing is about military housing that Hawley says has been neglected for years. The other is about what the military is and isn't actually telling its personnel to do. And by the end, there's a bigger question here about whether Washington is really taking care of the people who defend this country. Let's get into it.
Thank you very much to the ranking member, and thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks to the witnesses for being here. General Stitt, let me talk with you. Let me start with you, if I could. I have spoken repeatedly with the Secretary of the Army about replacing aging homes at Fort Leonard Wood in my home state. And there is no doubt in my mind that service members deserve better than they are getting right now. I was just there a few weeks ago. I toured the homes myself. I spoke to residents. I spoke to spouses. I spoke to children who lived in the homes. These homes need to be replaced. What concerns me is the Army doesn't seem to have a plan to replace this aging housing stock. So let me just ask you this. In your opinion, how does the availability or maybe lack of availability of quality military housing for service members and their families affect recruiting and retention?
Senator Hawley, good afternoon. The Army takes the care and quality of life of all of our service members and their families very seriously. So we are making and committed to investing in our housing within not just that, but within our daycare centers, child care, offering opportunities, expanding beyond that for spousal employment, to put kind of a whole package on the table to ensure that our facilities and our care and commitment towards family members is first class.
You say a whole package. When will we be seeing this package?
Senator, we continue to work on it, and I can take that question for the record, please.
Well, that's fine. I mean, but let me just say again, for the record, I've said this in the full committee. I'll say it again here, that I think we're past the point of continuing to kick this down the road. I mean, this is a problem now. Frankly, at Fort Leonard Wood, it was a problem a decade ago. But listen, I've been there. I mean, I've seen it myself. I've talked to the service members myself. I've been in their houses. I've been in their kitchens. I've looked at their bathrooms where there's mold growing. I've seen that they don't have places for their kids. I've seen the substandard living conditions, and it just isn't acceptable, General. You know what? I promised those service members that I'd be a royal pain in the you-know-what until something changed. So I'm keeping that commitment, and I'm going to continue it until something changes. And frankly, I've heard this now it's going on 2 years. I've only been in the Senate 3, but I've heard it continuously that, well, we'll get to it, we'll get to it, we'll get to it. Well, at Fort Leonard Wood, we haven't gotten to it. And I bet, if we went around the table here, I bet that the other members of the subcommittee would have the same situation in their state. So I'll give you the question for the record, but I just want to put on notice again, and you can take this back, that I want to see some progress on this, and I want to see it soon. And what I don't want to see are any more commitments from the Army that they're going to spend X number of dollars. This happened last year. We're going to commit X number of dollars to Fort Leonard Wood, and then as it turns out, $0 were spent on housing. I'm still ticked off about that. And I don't want to see it happen again, and I want to see progress made. So that's my piece. I think you understand where I'm coming from. General Miller, let me come to you. Can you help me with something here? Andersen Air Force Base, I understand, this is in Guam, of course. Leaders there recently received an official email that prohibited them from using pronouns or descriptors like he, she, youngest, oldest, male, or female. Why is that? I mean, what's going on?
Senator Hawley, thank you for that question. Actually, that is, we've been talking a lot about that because it was an email, from my understanding, that went out locally from one of the commanders there, and I don't remember at what level. I don't know if it was a group commander or the wing commander there. I believe that it was a Facebook post that went out based on a question. It is not the Air Force policy to not use pronouns. And so I think it was a social media, exacerbated by individuals that said that they were directed for that.
Okay, good. Well, I think that's progress. So you're saying, I'm looking at a news article here published August 31, 2022, saying that PACAF has sent this letter around. Leaders of the base are instructed, do not use pronouns, age, race, etc. And they go on. The unauthorized examples of unauthorized language are male, female, youngest, oldest, he, she. But you're saying that that was not an official communication. That has not been a directive.
That is not an official communication from the HAF. Correct.
Okay. And so your position to me is today that is not policy, and that they have not been so instructed.
That is
that
correct.
This is
that
social
is not
media
policy.
kerfuffle. I mean, this is not real. It's not happening.
I don't know if it's not happening, but it is not an official policy from the Department of the Air Force.
Okay. I ask because part of the way it's been reported is that the rationale is to help with lethality and also recruiting. And it was curious as heck how not using he, she can help with lethality and how it's helping with recruiting. But I take your word for it that this is not policy, and that satisfies me. So thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Now, I want to start with the part of this hearing that I think should concern every American, regardless of political party. Military families are being asked to make enormous sacrifices for this country. These are people who move when they're told to move. They deal with deployments. They deal with long periods away from loved ones. Spouses may have to put careers on hold. Children have to leave schools and friends behind. And the entire family lives with the uncertainty that comes with military service. So when a senator comes into a hearing and says that he's personally visited military housing, walked through these homes, talked to residents, talked to spouses, talked to children, and seen conditions involving mold and deteriorating facilities, I think we need to pay attention. Because this isn't some abstract Washington policy debate. We're talking about American families. And quite frankly, I think we've reached a point in this country where we sometimes make things far more complicated than they need to be. If the men and women defending America are living in housing that's unsafe or seriously deteriorated, then fix the housing. That's it. We can debate the federal budget all day long. We can argue about taxes. We can fight about spending. We can debate foreign aid. We can argue about whether Washington spends too much or too little. But when it comes to the people wearing the uniform, we should at least be able to agree that their families deserve a safe place to live. And what makes Senator Hawley's questioning especially interesting is that he isn't saying this is a brand new problem. He's saying this has been going on for years. He describes Fort Leonard Wood as having a housing problem that was already serious a decade ago. And that's where I have to ask the same question he's asking. Why is this still happening? Because Washington is very good at making promises. We're going to invest. We're going to study the problem. We're going to develop a plan. We're committed to improving quality of life. We're going to come back to Congress. We're going to work on it. Okay, but when does the talking stop? When does the money actually get spent? When do the families actually see the improvements? That's what matters. The general tells Hawley that the Army takes the quality of life of service members and their families very seriously. And I want to believe that. I really do. But there's a difference between taking something seriously and actually solving it. If you've got a military family living in a home with serious mold problems, you don't need another statement saying the Army is committed. You need somebody to come in and fix the problem. And if the house is too old or too deteriorated to reasonably repair, then replace it. This is where I think the senator's frustration is completely understandable. He says he has been hearing the same promises for years. And then he makes an even more serious allegation. That money had supposedly been committed to Fort Leonard Wood housing, but ultimately $0 were spent on housing. Now, obviously, whenever a politician makes a claim like that, we should want the documentation. That's just common sense. I don't care if it's Josh Hawley making the claim. I don't care if it's a Republican. I don't care if it's a Democrat. Show us the numbers. Where is the money supposed to go? Was it appropriated? Was it obligated? Was it actually spent? If it wasn't spent, why wasn't spent? And who was responsible for the failure? Because if Congress approved money for military housing and the money somehow doesn't make it to the people who need it, that's not something we should just shrug our shoulders about. And this is where I think conservatives have every right to be skeptical of the way Washington operates. Government can become incredibly good at creating bureaucracy around simple problems. A problem gets identified. A committee studies it. Another committee reviews it. A budget gets discussed. A plan gets developed. A new plan gets developed. And suddenly 10 years have passed. Meanwhile, the soldier is still living in the same house. That's unacceptable. And I'm not saying that every military housing problem can be solved overnight. Obviously, construction takes time. Budgets take time. Contracts take time. Environmental and engineering requirements exist for a reason. But there is a difference between reasonable government process and government paralysis. If a problem has been known for a decade, then we shouldn't still be acting like we're discovering it. And here's another thing that stood out to me. Hawley says he spoke with children who lived in these homes. Think about that. These aren't just soldiers complaining about a broken faucet. These are families. A soldier who might be willing to tolerate poor conditions because they signed up knowing military service comes with hardship. But what about their kids? What do those kids sign up for? Nothing. They didn't volunteer to serve. Their parents did. So if we're asking military families to make sacrifices for America, the government should at least make sure those families aren't being forgotten once they're inside the gates of a military installation. And this connects directly to the recruiting problem. The general talks about recruiting and retention, and I think this is incredibly important. America doesn't have an infinite supply of people willing to volunteer for military service. We need Americans to look at the military and believe that serving is honorable, worthwhile, and respected. And we also need families to believe that their loved ones are going to be treated properly. Imagine you're a young American considering joining the Army. You're thinking about your future. You're thinking about your career. Maybe you're married. Maybe you have children. And then you hear stories about military families living in deteriorating homes while the government spends years promising to fix them. You might start asking yourself whether the sacrifice is worth it. That's not a culture war issue. That's a readiness issue. That's a national security issue. And I think that's why the quality of life of our service members should be treated as part of military strength. A strong military isn't just about missiles and aircraft. It's about people. It's about recruiting. It's about retaining experienced personnel. It's about morale. It's about leadership. And it's about whether the men and women serving believe that their government actually has their backs. Now, the general talks about a whole package that includes housing, childcare, daycare, and opportunities for military spouses. And to be fair, that's an important point. Military families have needs beyond housing. A military spouse may struggle to maintain a career because of frequent relocations. A family may struggle to find affordable childcare. A service member might have children who need stable educational opportunities. So yes, we should look at the entire picture. But here's my concern. The phrase whole package can also become another way for government officials to give a very broad answer to a very specific question. Hawley didn't ask whether the Army cares about families. He asked what the Army is actually going to do about housing. That's the answer I want to hear. What is the plan? How much will it cost? When does construction start? When will the family see results? Those are measurable questions, and government accountability should be measurable. Then the hearing takes a completely different turn. Hawley asks about Andersen Air Force Base in Guam and an alleged communication involving the use of pronouns and descriptors such as male, female, youngest, and oldest. Now, as a conservative, I understand why something like this would immediately raise eyebrows. Because we've seen institutions across America get increasingly wrapped up in language debates, identity politics, and bureaucratic terminology. And conservatives have legitimate questions about whether some of these policies actually make America stronger. But here's where I think we have to be careful. The witness tells Hawley that this was not official Department of the Air Force policy. That's an important clarification. The official response is essentially, whatever communication you're referring to, it wasn't an official Air Force-wide policy telling personnel they couldn't use pronouns. And I think we should take that answer seriously. Being conservative doesn't mean believing every headline that confirms what you already think. Being patriotic doesn't mean automatically assuming the worst about your own military. If something is an official policy, then we shouldn't report it as though it is. That's an important principle. But I also understand why Hawley asks the question. Because if there really were official military policies telling service members what ordinary words they could or couldn't use, Americans would absolutely have the right to question whether that contributes to military readiness. And that's where the senator makes an interesting point. He asks how not using words like he or she would somehow improve military lethality or recruiting. That's a fair question. The American military has a mission. It isn't a university campus. It isn't a corporate HR department. It isn't a social media company. Its primary job is to defend the United States. That means training people to fight, operate sophisticated equipment, respond to threats, maintain discipline, and ultimately protect American lives. So whenever a military policy is introduced, I think conservatives are right to ask a simple question. Does this make the military more effective? Does it improve readiness? Does it improve morale? Does it help recruitment? Does it help retention? Does it improve the ability of our troops to accomplish their mission? If the answer is yes, explain how. If the answer is no, then why are we doing it? That's not hatred. That's accountability. But there's another side to this. We shouldn't allow political outrage to become a substitute for evidence. That's one of the biggest problems in our politics today. A story gets published. People get angry. Social media picks it up. Then suddenly a local incident becomes a national policy. And by the time somebody comes along and says, wait a minute, that's not actually what happened, the damage is already done. As a conservative, I don't want that either. If we want people to take conservative arguments seriously, we have to be willing to separate legitimate criticism from exaggeration. If the military is actually implementing something ridiculous, expose it. If it's not, say that too. Because credibility matters. And I think that's actually one of the more interesting things about this hearing. Hawley comes in with a concern about the alleged policy. The military official says it isn't official policy. Hawley presses for clarification. And once he receives the answer, he essentially moves on. That's what congressional oversight should look like. Ask the question. Demand an answer. If the answer is sufficient, move forward. If it's not, keep digging. That's much better than simply yelling at each other for the cameras. Now, if I had one major criticism of this entire situation, it's that both sides of this hearing represent a broader problem in Washington. We're constantly fighting about symbolic issues while real problems can sit unresolved for years. And I'm not saying cultural issues don't matter. They do. The military absolutely should have standards. The military absolutely should maintain discipline. The military absolutely should prioritize readiness. But if we're having a debate about whether someone can use a particular word while military families are living in deteriorating homes, then I think we need to make sure our priorities are in the right order. Take care of the troops. Take care of their families. Maintain readiness. Make sure the military can fight and win. Then deal with everything else. That's my perspective. And I think there's a larger conservative principle here. Government should be judged by results, not intentions, not press releases, not speeches, results. If the Army says it's going to fix military housing, then fix it. If Congress allocates money, make sure the money is actually used properly. If officials say something isn't policy, then provide enough transparency that Americans can verify that. And if the military adopts a policy that affects readiness, explain why it's necessary. That should be the standard. And I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation from the American people. We spend enormous amounts of money on our military because we understand that national defense is one of the government's most important responsibilities. And I support having a strong American military. I support giving our service members the tools they need. I support maintaining America's military superiority. But supporting the military doesn't mean giving military leadership a blank check. In fact, I would argue the opposite. If you truly support the troops, you should be willing to ask whether the system is treating them properly. You should be willing to ask where the money is going. You should be willing to ask why a known problem has lasted for years. And you should be willing to demand better. That's what Senator Hawley is doing here with the housing issue. Now, whether you agree with Hawley on every political issue is irrelevant. The question is whether military families at Fort Leonard would deserve better. If the conditions he described are accurate, my answer is yes. Absolutely. They deserve better, and they shouldn't have to wait another decade to get it. The men and women serving America aren't asking the government for luxury. They're asking for basic standards: safe housing, proper childcare, support for their families, a functioning system, and leaders who actually follow through. That's not too much to ask. And I think that's the part of this hearing that deserves far more attention than the political theatrics. Because at the end of the day, these soldiers aren't going home to Washington. They're going back to their families. They're going back to those houses. They're going back to the facilities that Congress is discussing. So when a senator says, "I want to see progress," I think the next question should be, what does progress actually look like? Is the mold gone? Are the homes being replaced? Are contracts being signed? Is construction underway? Are families moving into better homes? That's how we should measure it, not by how passionate the hearings sounded, not by how many clips went viral, not by how many people applauded, by whether anything actually changed. And that's ultimately where I land on this hearing. As a right-leaning American, I believe strongly in a powerful military, strong national defense, personal responsibility, and respect for the people who choose to wear the uniform. But I also believe in accountability. Our military deserves the best. Our service members deserve the best. And their families deserve to know that when their loved one goes overseas to defend this country, the government isn't going to forget about the people waiting for them back home. At the same time, we shouldn't turn every questionable social media post or local communication into a nationwide scandal without verifying what actually happened. We can be tough on government without being reckless with the facts. We can criticize the Pentagon without disrespecting the people in uniform. We can demand traditional standards and military readiness without falling for every viral claim that appears online. And most importantly, we can love America enough to demand that the institutions serving it actually work. That's the kind of patriotism I believe in. Not blind loyalty, not blind opposition. Accountability. If you're going to ask Americans to serve, sacrifice, deploy, and potentially put their lives on the line, then you better be prepared to take care of them and their families. And if Washington can't get something as basic as safe military housing right after years of warnings, then somebody needs to explain why. Because the American taxpayer is paying for it. The military families are living with it. And our national security ultimately depends on the people wearing that uniform. So now the real question isn't what was said during this hearing. The real question is what happens after it. Will Fort Leonard Wood finally see meaningful investment? Will those families actually see their living conditions improve? And will Congress continue following up until there's a measurable result? Because if the answer is yes, then this hearing accomplished something. If the answer is no, then we've just watched another round of politicians and military officials talking while the people who matter most continue waiting. And personally, I think America's service members deserve more than promises. They deserve results.